thing people fear most is usually the thing they taught themselves to see, the old ranch cook used to say, and Elias Mercer remembered that line the morning he rode into Rattlesnake Crossing and found a silver pendant lying in the middle of Main Street like the town had dropped its own heart. The sun was barely up. Dust was still pale. A wagon wheel had cut half a crescent through the dirt beside it, and boot prints crossed around it in nervous circles, as if men had come close, changed their minds, then backed away. Elias sat on his horse for a second longer than he needed to. He almost kept riding. He had done that before in other places, and it had usually been the right choice. But there was something in the way the street held its breath that made him pull the reins and swing down slow. His knees were stiff from 3 days in the saddle. His throat felt lined with sand. He rubbed the cracked edge of his hat brim with his thumb, once, then again, and looked toward the boarding house windows. Curtains moved. No faces stayed long enough to belong to them. On the far side of the street, a dog stood under the shade of a trough and would not cross into the sun. Elias bent and picked up the pendant. Silver. Small. Handmade. Not polished fancy, but worn smooth where fingers had touched it many times. The cord attached to it had been snapped, not cut. That mattered, though he did not know why yet. He had seen men fake signs before. They were always too clean about it. This was not clean. The saloon door opened behind him, and a deputy with red eyes and yesterday's shirt stepped out like sleep had failed him. He saw the pendant in Elias's hand and stopped cold. "You ought to put that down," he said. Elias turned the pendant once between his fingers. "Belongs to somebody." "That is the trouble," the deputy said. "Everybody knows who." He did not say the name right away. He did not have to. The silence around it arrived first. Then a pair of boys by the hitch rail quit whispering. Then a woman carrying a flour sack crossed the street without looking up. Then the name came low, like the man did not want the morning to hear it. Nita Van. Elias looked past him then, toward the edge of town, where the abandoned chapel leaned into its own shadow. A woman stood there near the fence line, still as a post at first glance, though not dead still, not unnatural. Just controlled. Apache. Dark hair braided tight. Buckskin skirt worn under a faded wool shawl. One hand resting near the broken gate. The other at her side. She was not staring at the town. She was staring at the hills beyond it, like the town was only weather she had learned to wait through. Even from across the distance, Elias could feel how badly the street wanted her to turn into what it feared. He had seen mobs form slower than this and kinder than this, and none of them had ended clean. The deputy came closer. 2 calves gone this week. A rider vanished after sundown. Old Mrs. Bell swears she heard crying outside her place and found tracks under her window. Elias glanced down. Animal tracks. Something like that. Elias said nothing. His horse shifted behind him, leather creaking, bit clicking once. The sound felt loud. He looked again at the pendant, then at the woman by the chapel. She had not moved much, but now he saw one change. Her thumb had come up to touch the place on her neck where the cord should have been. Not panic. Not surprise. Recognition. That small movement settled deeper in him than the deputy's warnings had. People lie with their mouths every day. Their hands do a worse job of it. "You know her?" the deputy asked. "No," Elias said. "Then take my advice and keep it that way." Elias almost handed the pendant over. Almost. Instead he closed his hand around it and felt the leftover warmth of someone else's skin. Same way his father once held onto a spent cartridge when he could not explain a thing that had gone wrong. Across the street, Nita finally turned her head. Her eyes met his for only a moment. No plea. No welcome. Just a look that said she knew exactly what he was holding, and exactly how much trouble had already gathered around it. Then the chapel bell moved in the wind without making a sound, and somewhere behind the stable a child began to cry hard enough to make every grown person On the street flinch fear travels faster when it finds a name to sit on, Elias thought, though he did not say it out loud, and by the time the child's crying broke across the street like a drop plate, the town had already begun arranging itself around that single name. The deputy stepped away first, like distance might keep whatever this was from touching him directly, and the saloon door behind him shut with a dull thud that sounded final in the morning air. Elias stayed where he was, the pendant still closed in his hand, feeling heavier now, not because of the metal but because of how many eyes had decided what it meant. The child's crying came from behind the stable, sharp and uneven, not the kind that fades on its own. A woman hurried past him, flour sack forgotten at her side, her steps quick but careful, like the ground might shift if she moved too fast. Elias watched her go, then glanced once more toward the chapel. Nita Van had not come closer. She had not called out. She had only shifted her weight slightly, enough that the morning light caught the side of her face and showed no fear there, only a kind of tired patience that did not belong to someone surprised by what was happening. That bothered him more than anything else. People who were innocent usually tried to look it when a town turned its gaze on them. People who were guilty tried harder. She was doing neither. Elias slipped the pendant into his coat pocket and started toward the stable, boots grinding soft into the dust, each step sounding louder than it should have. The air smelled like hay and old leather and something underneath that he could not place yet, something faintly burned. As he rounded the corner, he saw the child sitting in the dirt, knees pulled tight to his chest, hands pressed over his ears as if trying to keep a sound from getting back in. A man, likely the boy's father, knelt beside him, speaking low and fast, words tumbling over each other without landing anywhere useful. "He won't say it again," the man muttered when he saw Elias approach, as if that explained anything. "He said it once. That's enough." Elias crouched a few feet away, not too close. "What did he say?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter." It mattered. Everything did, once fear got hold of it. Elias shifted his gaze to the boy. "You can tell me," he said, keeping his voice steady, not soft, not hard. The boy's eyes flicked up, wide and wet, and for a second Elias thought he would speak, but then the boy's mouth closed tight and his head shook once, sharp and final. Not refusal. Something closer to warning. Elias leaned back slightly, giving him space, and that was when he noticed the ground behind the boy, just beyond where the crying had started. Tracks. Not clean. Not clear. But there. Hoof marks, yes, but cut through with something else, straight lines, pressure points too even, too deliberate. A heel. A human heel. He looked at it longer than he should have, long enough for the father to follow his gaze and then quickly look away, like he had already seen it and chosen not to understand. "Animals get close to the stable all the time," the man said, too quickly. Elias did not answer. He stood instead, brushing dust from his hands, and let the silence sit between them until it grew uncomfortable. That was when the preacher arrived, coat buttoned wrong, Bible held like a tool instead of a comfort. "We need to gather people," he said to no one and everyone at once. "Before night comes again." Elias turned slightly. "It's barely morning." "That's how it starts," the preacher replied. "You wait, and it grows." He did not look at the tracks. He did not look at the boy. He looked past Elias, toward the chapel, toward the woman standing there as if she had been placed for this moment. "We know what this is." Elias followed that line of sight again, slower this time. Nita had moved closer to the fence, one hand now resting on the broken wood, her thumb still near the place where the pendant should have been. She was watching them now, not the hills. Watching the boy. Watching the men. Watching how quickly a story could finish itself without needing truth to help it along. Elias felt the weight in his pocket again and understood something small but important. Whatever had been taken from her had not been lost in the way the town believed. It had been pulled into this. Used. Or about to be. The wind shifted then, carrying that faint burn smell stronger for a moment, and Elias turned his head slightly, following it toward the edge of the stable where a dark smear marked the wood low to the ground. Not lightning. Not accident. Too controlled. Too placed. He stepped toward it, ignoring the way the preacher's voice rose behind him, calling names, calling men, building something that would not be easy to stop once it stood up on its own. Elias crouched again, closer to the mark, and ran his fingers just above it without touching. Ash. Fine. Recent. He glanced back at the tracks, at the mix of hoof and heel, and then at the boy, who had gone quiet now, not because he was comforted, but because he had decided something about speaking that no one else in the yard had. Elias straightened slowly, the pieces not fitting yet, but no longer scattered either. Behind him, more boots were arriving, more voices layering over each other, turning uncertainty into something that sounded like agreement. Across the open stretch of dirt, Nita Van remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping away, and in that stillness Elias saw the shape of what the day would become if no one broke it, a town that would rather be certain than be right, and a truth that would have to stand alone long enough to be noticed. By midday the heat had settled into the town like a weight no one could shift, and with it came a different kind of silence, one that did not come from peace but from people thinking too much in the same direction. Elias stood under the thin shade beside the general store, hat tipped low, watching how groups formed and reformed along the street, how conversation stopped when certain names were spoken and started again with more certainty than they had earned. He had seen this before, though never with dust this red or sky this wide, and the pattern never changed much, first confusion, then suggestion, then agreement, and finally something that looked like truth from a distance but fell apart if you stood too close to it. He rubbed the edge of his hat again, slower this time, and let his gaze drift toward the chapel. Nita Van was no longer at the fence. For a moment he thought she had left, that she had done the sensible thing and walked away from a place already sharpening itself against her, but then he saw her nearer the well, drawing water with a motion so steady it seemed almost separate from everything else happening around her. No one stood close to her. No one offered help. Even the usual noise around the well, metal bucket, rope, idle talk, had thinned to almost nothing, as if sound itself did not want to be mistaken for siding with her. Elias pushed off from the wall and crossed the street, not fast, not slow, just enough to be seen doing it. A few heads turned. That was expected. What mattered was how many stayed turned. More than he liked. He reached the well as Nita lifted the bucket, water sloshing once against the rim before settling. She did not look up right away. "You picked it up," she said, her voice even, not accusing, not grateful, just stating something already known. Elias rested one hand on the wood of the well. Seemed like something that shouldn't be left in the dirt. She nodded once, still not looking at him. Most things shouldn't be. He studied her face then, the way the light caught along the edge of her cheek, the way her expression held nothing extra, no wasted motion, no signal meant for the watching town behind him. "It was torn," he said. "Not cut." That made her pause. Just a fraction. Enough. Her thumb moved again, brushing the place at her neck where the cord had been. "Then whoever took it didn't have time to be careful," she said. Elias let that sit. Or didn't want to be. That, finally, brought her eyes up to his. There was something in them then, not surprise, not relief, but recognition of a different kind. Not of him, but of the direction he was willing to look. "You see more than most," she said quietly. "Or maybe I've just seen the same trick too many times," Elias replied. Behind them, a chair scraped hard against wood from inside the store, the sound cutting through the air like a signal. Voices followed, louder now, less contained. The preacher again, joined by two of the larger cattle owners, men who spoke as if the land itself had given them permission to decide things for everyone else. "We cannot wait," one of them was saying. "Not after this morning." Elias did not turn right away. "They're building something," he said. Nita set the bucket down, water settling with a soft, final sound. "They already have," she answered. "You're just now seeing the frame." Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the heat press in against his ribs. "That boy," he said. He didn't look like he was lying. He looked like he was choosing not to speak. Nita nodded once. Because speaking would make it real in a way he can't take back. What did he see? Elias asked. She shook her head. What he thinks he saw is already enough for them. That was the problem. Not the truth, but the version of it that spread easier. Elias reached into his coat and pulled the pendant out, letting it catch the light for a second before closing his hand around it again. This belongs with you, he said. She did not take it. Not right now. Why? Because the moment you hand it back, every eye here will decide that means something they already want to believe. Elias glanced over his shoulder. The group by the store had grown. More men. More certainty. And if I keep it, he asked. Then it belongs to you for a while, she said. And so does whatever comes with it. He let out a short breath that almost passed for a laugh. That sounds like a poor trade. It is, she said. Most true things are. A gust of wind moved through the street then, lifting dust in a low spiral that crossed between them and the watching town, blurring edges for just a second. In that brief cover, Nita leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping just enough that it would not carry. There are two kinds of tracks out there, she said. You saw that? Yeah. One is meant to be followed, she continued. The other is meant to make you stop looking. Elias felt the shape of that settle in his mind, not fully formed yet, but close. And which one do they want? He asked. Her eyes flicked once toward the men by the store. The one that ends with me. The dust settled. The space between them cleared. And just like that, the moment passed, visible again to anyone who cared to see it. Elias slipped the pendant back into his pocket, the weight of it now tied not just to a mystery, but to a choice he had not fully made yet. Across the street, the preacher raised his voice higher, calling for men to gather at sundown, to bring lanterns, to bring rifles if they had them, to bring certainty where doubt had lingered too long. Elias watched the faces turn toward that call, watched how quickly hesitation gave way to something that felt easier to carry. He had seen that too many times to mistake it for courage. He looked back at Nita. She had already lifted the bucket again, already turned slightly away, as if the conversation had ended before it could be seen ending. You don't have to stay, she said without looking at him. Elias adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing slightly against the glare. That's true, he said. He did not move. Somewhere behind him, a hammer struck wood, once, then again, like the town was building something it did not understand how to take apart. By late afternoon the town had changed shape without moving a single building, and Elias could feel it in the way sound carried, shorter, sharper, as if every voice was trying to reach a conclusion before the sun dropped too low. He stood near the hitching posts with his horse tied loose, not because he planned to leave, but because he wanted the option to look like he might. That alone bought him a kind of space most men did not notice until they needed it. The pendant rested in his pocket like a second pulse, steady and unwelcome, and every now and then his hand drifted toward it without quite touching, as if checking that the problem was still there and had not somehow solved itself in the heat. It had not. Across the street, boards were being nailed across the windows of the old feed shed, not to keep anything out, but to give the men something to stand against when night came, a line they could pretend was solid. Elias watched the hammer rise and fall, the rhythm too even to be nervous, which meant the man swinging it had already decided what he believed. That was always the dangerous part, not fear itself, but fear that had settled into certainty. A pair of riders came in from the north trail then, horses lathered, heads low, and for a second the entire street leaned toward them as if pulled by a single string. One of the riders slid from his saddle too fast and nearly went down with it, catching himself on the horn with a grunt that carried farther than he intended. We found him, he said, not needing to say who. The sheriff. Or what was left of him. They led the second horse forward, and the shape across its back did not move the way a living man does, even when he's unconscious. Elias stepped closer without thinking, then slowed, letting others crowd in first. He had learned long ago that the first look was rarely the clearest one. Better to watch how others reacted to it. The body was laid out on a table dragged from the store, boots still on, coat torn open at the shoulder, shirt dark with something that had dried and stiffened in the sun. No clean wounds. No neat explanation. Just damage that suggested struggle and confusion and something that did not end quickly. Tracks, someone asked. The rider shook his head. Lost them in the arroyo. Another man leaned in, squinting as if looking harder would turn what he saw into something simpler. Animal, he said. Has to be. Elias's gaze dropped to the sheriff's boots, to the caked dirt along the heels, and he felt that same quiet resistance rise in him again. Too much human in it. Too much that did not fit the story already forming. He stepped in closer then, ignoring the way a few shoulders stiffened at his approach. Mind if I take a look? He asked. No one answered right away. Then the preacher nodded, not because he trusted Elias, but because he wanted more voices to agree with him. Elias leaned over the table, careful, not touching yet, just seeing. The tear in the coat had been made from the front, not the side. The fabric was pulled, not sliced. And there, along the edge of the sleeve, a mark, dark, fine, like ash ground into the cloth. The same smell from the stable came back to him, stronger now in memory than it had been in the air. He straightened slowly. You lost the tracks, he said to the rider. But before that... The man hesitated, then shrugged. Mess of them. Hooves. Scrapes. Couldn't tell one from another. Any boot marks? Elias asked. The rider frowned, thinking. Maybe. Hard to say. It was always hard to say when the answer did not help. Elias stepped back, letting the others fill the space again, and watched how quickly the conclusion rebuilt itself without him. Animal. Curse. The word did not need to be spoken now. It hung there anyway. He turned his head slightly and saw Nita standing at the edge of the crowd, not pushing in, not pulling away, just present enough that no one could pretend she was not there. The space around her was wider than it should have been, like an invisible line had been drawn that no one wanted to cross from either side. Her eyes moved once over the sheriff's body, then to Elias, then away again, not lingering, not inviting. He understood that look now. Not distance. Control. If she let any more of herself show, the town would take it and twist it into proof. A hand clapped down on Elias's shoulder then, heavier than it needed to be. One of the cattle men. Broad, sunburned, the kind who believed in simple answers because they made hard land easier to live on. You see it too, don't you? Or the man said. Elias met his gaze, neutral. I see a man who didn't die clean. That's what I'm saying, the man replied, tightening his grip slightly. This ain't human. Elias let the silence stretch just long enough to make the man uncomfortable. Maybe not in the way you want it to be, he said finally. The grip loosened. Not gone. Just unsure. The preacher stepped forward then, voice rising again, calling for the gathering at sundown to be moved sooner, to act before night had the chance to hide anything else. Agreement followed, quick and loud, because it felt like movement, and movement felt like safety. Elias stepped back out of the circle, the heat pressing in, the noise building, and for a moment he closed his eyes against it, just long enough to listen past it. Wind. Distant. The faint creak of the chapelwood. And under that, something else, not a sound, exactly, but the absence of one, a gap where something should have been. He opened his eyes and looked toward the edge of town, toward the arroyos where the tracks had been lost, where the story had broken just enough to let something else through. Behind him, the town was choosing its path, hammering it into place with voices and hands and fear that had found its direction. In front of him, the land waited, not offering answers, only the chance to look for them without help. Elias touched the pendant through his coat this time, not by accident, but by decision, and felt the weight of it settle into something steadier than doubt. Not certainty. Not yet. But close enough to move. The sun dipped lower but the heat did not leave, it only changed character, turning from something that pressed down into something that wrapped around, and by the time the first lantern was lit the town had already gathered itself into a shape that no longer needed daylight to hold together. Elias stood just outside the main cluster of men, close enough to hear every word, far enough that no one thought to ask him to speak first. That suited him. The pendant rested against his chest now, not in his pocket, the cord looped through a buttonhole in his coat where it would not fall easily, not again. He had made that decision without thinking too hard about it, which usually meant it was the right one, or at least the one he would not be able to undo later. The preacher's voice carried above the rest, steady, practiced, the kind of tone that made fear sound like duty. "We act together," he was saying. "We do not let this spread. Spread. As if it were a sickness. As if naming it that way made it easier to contain." Elias watched the faces around him, the way men nodded not because they understood, but because they wanted to stand on the same side of something. A rifle was passed from one hand to another. A lantern wick was turned up too high, flame jumping and then settling into something harsher than needed. Small choices. All of them pointing in one direction. He shifted his weight slightly and let his gaze move beyond the circle, toward the darker edge of town where the buildings gave way to open ground. Nita stood there again, not hidden, not part of the gathering, just outside it in a way that made her more visible than if she had been in the middle. She had not armed herself. No rifle. No knife that he could see. Just that same stillness, now edged with something sharper, not fear, but readiness for something she had already accepted would come. Elias stepped away from the group before anyone could pull him deeper into it and crossed the open space toward her, boots quiet in the dust, the noise behind him rising as plans turned into orders. "They're going out tonight," he said when he was close enough that he did not need to raise his voice. "Not looking," she replied. "Hunting." He let that word settle. It fit too well. "You knew it would turn this way," he said. "I knew they would need it to," she answered. He glanced back once, watching the lantern light flicker across faces that had already decided what they would see in the dark. "If it's not you," he said, "then it's someone who wants it to be you." Yes. No hesitation. No surprise. Just agreement. "Why?" he asked. Nita's eyes moved past him, toward the men, then beyond them, toward the land that stretched out in long, quiet lines. "Because stories like this make room for other things to happen without being seen," she said. Elias felt that click into place with what he had already noticed, the ash, the tracks, the way certain details were ignored too quickly. "The sheriff," he said. "He was close to something." "Closer than he should have been," she replied. "And now?" Elias asked. "Now the wrong thing is easier to find," she said. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke, not from any one fire, but from several, small and controlled, scattered in a way that did not match cooking or warmth. Elias turned his head slightly, following it, mapping it without moving. "Those burns," he said. "At the stable?" "On his coat." Nita nodded once. "Marks that say one thing," she said, while hiding another. Behind them, a shout went up as a group of men started moving, forming a line that would push out toward the arroyos, lanterns held high, rifles angled low but ready to rise. Elias watched them for a second, then looked back at her. "If they find nothing," he said, "they'll come back with less patience." "They won't find nothing," Nita replied. "They will find what they're meant to find." Elias exhaled slowly. "Then I go ahead of them," he said. It was not a question. She studied him for a moment, measuring something he could not see. "If you follow the wrong sign," she said, "you will help them without knowing it." "And if I follow the right one?" he asked. "You may not make it back in time to stop them," she said. That was the cost. He understood that. Choices that closed other choices. He adjusted the brim of his hat, eyes narrowing slightly as the last of the sun slipped below the horizon and the lantern light took over completely. "Show me the difference," he said. Nita was quiet for a second, then she stepped closer, just enough that her voice would not carry. "The tracks that are meant to be followed are loud," she said. "Broken brush. Deep prints. Easy direction." Elias nodded once. "And the others?" "They look like mistakes," she said. Like something tried to hide and failed. He let that settle, turning it over once, twice, feeling where it caught. People who are good at hiding don't leave mistakes, he said. Not real ones. Nita's eyes held his. Exactly. Behind them, the line of men began to move, boots and hooves and light pushing outward in a slow wave that would only gain speed once it left the last building behind. Elias looked at it, then back at the land in the opposite direction, where the dark was deeper and less certain. If I don't come back, he said, they'll take that as proof. They already have proof, she replied. They just haven't used it yet. He almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was true in a way that made everything else feel thinner. He reached up and touched the pendant briefly, then dropped his hand. Then I'd better give them something better, he said. Nita stepped back, the space between them returning as if it had never closed. Or something worse, she said quietly. Elias turned then, not toward the line of lanterns, but away from it, into the darker stretch of land where the wind moved differently and the ground held its secrets closer. Behind him, the town advanced with noise and light and certainty. Ahead of him, there was only shadow, and the faint, uneven suggestion of tracks that did not want to be seen. The darkness outside the reach of the town did not fall all at once, it gathered. In layers, settling first into the low places, then stretching outward until even the open ground felt enclosed, and Elias moved through it at a pace that balanced speed with listening, each step placed with care so the land would speak back if it chose to. Behind him, the lantern line pushed into the arroyos with noise enough to scare anything honest away, but that was not what worried him. What worried him was how quiet the other direction felt, how the wind moved without interruption, how the ground held its shape without the disturbance of men who believed they were tracking something real. He crouched once, twice, studying the dirt where the light from the town no longer reached, and there they were again, the obvious signs first, the ones meant to be seen. Deep hoof impressions. Broken stems. A dragged line that suggested weight being pulled, something struggling, something dramatic enough to satisfy a story already written. Elias followed them for 10 paces, maybe 15, letting himself feel how easy it would be to stay with them, how natural it felt to move in that direction, how quickly a man could convince himself that easy meant correct. Then he stopped. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across his left side, and with it came that same faint smell, ash, fine and deliberate. Not from a large fire. From something controlled. He turned away from the deep tracks and let his eyes adjust to the darker ground beside them, the part most men would pass without looking because it did not ask to be seen. At first there was nothing. Then, slowly, the pattern broke. A shallow mark. Not quite a print. The edge of a heel that had not fully pressed down. A scuff where weight had been shifted carefully, not committed. Elias leaned closer, one hand resting lightly on his knee, breath slowed to keep the dust from rising. Mistakes, he murmured to himself, though he knew better than that now. Not mistakes. Choices that looked like mistakes. He moved along that line instead, stepping where the ground told him to, not where it invited him to, and the difference showed itself in small ways at first, then larger. The air felt tighter here, as if sound had less room to travel. The brush was disturbed, but not broken. Bent. Returned. A path made by someone who understood how to pass through without leaving a story behind. Elias followed it down into a shallow cut in the land, the walls rising just enough to block the wind, to hold the smell of ash closer, stronger now, undeniable. He paused at the edge, listening. Nothing. No movement. No animal sound. No human voice. Just the kind of quiet that comes when something has already happened and the place has not decided how to carry it yet. He slid down carefully, boots finding purchase without sending loose dirt ahead of him, and at the bottom he saw it, the remains of a fire, small, precise, built against the side of the arroyo where the light would not carry far. The ash was fine, grey, spread thin, not piled. No large wood. No cooking. No warmth. A signal, maybe. Or a marker. He crouched beside it, holding his hand just above the surface, feeling the faintest trace of heat still clinging to the ground. Recent. Not hours. Less. He glanced back toward the direction of the town, gauging distance, time, how long it would take the lantern line to reach the wrong place and believe what it found there. Not long enough. He stood and turned slowly, taking in the rest of the space. There, another sign. A piece of leather, cut rough, not torn, left half buried near the wall. He picked it up, turning it once in his fingers. Not from a saddle. Too thin. From a strap. Something carried. Something used. He slipped it into his coat beside the pendant and felt the two objects sit together, not matching, but connected in a way he could not ignore. A sound came then, faint but clear enough to pull his attention sharp, stone against stone, somewhere farther down the arroyo, out of sight. Not the wind. Not chance. Movement. Elias straightened, every sense narrowing toward that direction, and for a second he considered calling out, testing the space, seeing what answered. He did not. Some places answered better when you did not announce yourself. He moved instead, slower now, each step placed with intention, following the curve of the arroyo as it bent deeper into shadow. The walls rose higher here, the sky narrowing to a thin strip above, stars beginning to show through in cold, distant points. Another sound. Closer this time. A shift of weight. A breath that was not his. Elias stopped. Hand drifting not to a weapon, but to the pendant at his chest, as if grounding himself to something steady would keep him from reacting too soon. "I know you're there," he said, voice low, not carrying far. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, waiting, the kind that pressed back. Then, from the dark ahead, a shape moved, not rushing, not lunging, but stepping into what little light there was with a kind of control that matched the tracks he had followed. A man. Not what the town feared. Not what the story demanded. Just a man, though there was something in the way he held himself, something cold and ready, that made the difference between ordinary and dangerous feel very thin. "You took a long way around," the man said, his voice rough, measured, as if he had expected someone, but not quite this someone. Elias let his eyes adjust fully, taking in details without staring, coat worn but maintained, boots marked with the same careful pattern he had followed, a rifle slung low but within reach. "Seemed like the straight path was meant for someone else," Elias replied. The man's mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile. "Smart," he said. "Or unlucky?" Elias did not answer that. He let the space hold for a second, then another, before speaking again. "You've got the town looking in the wrong place," he said. "That's the idea," the man replied. No denial. No hesitation. Just truth, offered like it cost him nothing. Elias felt something settle then, not relief, not yet, but direction. "Why her?" he asked. The man's gaze flicked past him, toward the distant glow of lanterns moving where they should not be. "Because they were already halfway there," he said. "People like easy endings." Elias's hand tightened slightly against the pendant. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" The man's eyes came back to him, steady, unreadable. "Room," he said. "To finish what I started before anyone thinks to look at the right thing." The wind found its way down into the arroyo then, thin and cold, carrying with it the distant noise of men who believed they were close to something. Elias stood there, between that sound and the man in front of him, and understood exactly how narrow the space had become, how little time there was to turn any of this before. It closed in completely. The space between them held steady, stretched thin but not yet broken, and Elias could feel the balance of it the way a man feels the edge of a blade without touching it, aware that one wrong move would turn everything sharp all at once. The man in the arroyo did not raise his rifle, did not shift his stance beyond what was needed to stay ready, and that alone told Elias more than any threat would have. This was not panic. This was planning that had already been set in motion and only needed time to finish. "What did you start?" Elias asked, his voice still low, not pushing, not retreating. The man tilted his head slightly, considering him as if measuring how much truth to spend. "Cattle roots," he said after a moment. Water access. Land that changes hands when people get scared enough to leave it. Elias felt the pieces connect, not cleanly, but enough. And the sheriff, he asked. Started asking the wrong questions, the man replied. Got closer than he understood. There was no pride in it. No regret either. Just fact. Elias let his gaze drop for a fraction of a second, then return. So you give them a story, he said. Something older than all of this. Something they won't question. The man's mouth moved again, that almost smile returning for half a breath. They were already telling it, he said. I just made sure it had teeth. The wind shifted again, bringing the faint echo of voices from the lantern line, louder now, closer to the place where the obvious tracks would end in something staged, something convincing enough to hold them for a while. Not long enough. Elias knew that. Not if no one gave them something stronger to replace it with. You're not going to get the time you think, Elias said. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. No. They'll find your trail runs out, Elias continued. They'll come back with more questions. By then I'll be gone, the man said. Elias shook his head once. Not with what you've left behind. That landed. Small, but enough. The man's weight shifted, just a fraction, just enough to show that he was recalculating. What do you think I left? He asked. Elias reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, giving the other man time to read the motion, to decide whether to react. He pulled out the strip of leather and held it up where the faint starlight could catch its edge. This, he said. And the ash. And the marks that don't belong to any animal. The man's gaze flicked to the leather, then back. That could be anything, he said. It could, Elias agreed. Until someone decides to look at it that way. The silence stretched again, thicker now, weighted with the understanding that this was no longer just about what had happened, but about what could still be turned. You're one man, the other said finally. Against a town that already knows what it believes. Elias nodded slightly. That's the problem, he said. Not the part I'm worried about. The man studied him for a longer moment this time, searching for something, hesitation, maybe, or doubt he could use. Then what are you worried about? He asked. Elias's hand moved to the pendant at his chest, fingers closing around it once, grounding, then releasing. That they won't stop once they're wrong, he said. That they'll need to stay right. The man's expression shifted, not much, but enough to show that he understood that kind of danger too. That's not my concern, he said. It will be, Elias replied, if you're still here when they come back. Another sound carried down the arroyo then, sharper, closer, a shout this time, not clear words, but the kind of noise men make when they think they've found something. The man's head turned slightly toward it, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for Elias to see the calculation change again, the timeline compressing, options narrowing. Looks like your story's working, Elias said. For now, the man answered. He shifted his stance then, more openly this time, one hand drifting closer to the rifle, not raising it, but no longer leaving it out of the conversation. You can walk away from this, he added. Go back to town. Let them finish what they started. Elias did not move. And you walk away with everything, he said. That's the plan, the man replied. The wind pressed through the arroyo again, stronger now, carrying dust that moved low along the ground, blurring edges, softening outlines. Elias took a slow breath, letting it out steady, feeling the moment narrow to something that would not hold much longer. You made one mistake, he said. The man's eye sharpened. Which one? Elias's gaze stayed level. You picked the wrong person to hang it on. For the first time, something like irritation crossed the man's face. She's exactly the right person, he said. No one here will question it. I will, Elias said. It was a simple answer. Not loud. Not dramatic. But it settled into the space between them with a weight that shifted everything just enough. The man watched him for a second longer, then exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled sound. "Then you won't make it back," he said. Elias did not argue that. He just adjusted his footing slightly, the ground firm beneath his boots, the pendant cool now against his chest, the noise of the town pressing closer from one direction while the quiet of the arroyo held from the other. Somewhere above them, a star slipped behind a thin line of cloud, and the last clean edge of light faded, leaving only shapes, movement, and the thin line between choosing to act and waiting too long to matter. The first shot did not come from Elias, and that was what saved him. It cracked through the arroyo from farther up the bend, sharp and sudden, the kind of sound that belonged to men who fired before they understood what they were seeing. The man in front of him reacted on instinct, not fear, his head turning toward the sound, his weight shifting just enough to open a line that had not been there a second before. Elias moved then, not fast, but exact, stepping into that opening, closing distance without reaching for a weapon, his shoulder driving forward to break the other man's balance before the rifle could come up clean. They collided hard, boots scraping against packed dirt, the narrow walls of the arroyo turning the struggle into something contained and immediate. The rifle struck stone with a dull crack, the sound swallowed quickly by the close air, and for a second both men were nothing but movement and pressure, trying to gain the kind of position that ended things before they stretched too far. Elias did not try to overpower him. He had learned that lesson young. Instead he shifted, redirected, let the man's own strength carry him half a step too far, then drove him sideways into the wall where the ground sloped unevenly. The man recovered faster than expected, twisting, elbow catching Elias in the ribs with enough force to steal a breath and blur the edges of the moment. Pain flared, sharp, but clean. Elias used it, let it sharpen his focus instead of breaking it, his hand catching the other man's sleeve, fingers closing over the fabric where the ash smell clung strongest. "You're done," Elias said, not because he believed it, but because sometimes words change the timing of a fight just enough to matter. The man did not answer. He drove forward again, harder now, less controlled, the calculation slipping as the situation refused to follow the plan he had built. They went down together, knees hitting dirt, hands searching for leverage, for anything that would end the balance. Elias felt the man's hand brush the rifle where it had fallen, so the intent before it became action, and shifted his weight, driving his forearm across the man's wrist, pinning it just long enough to break that line of movement. Another shot cracked above them, closer now, and a shout followed, clearer this time, words forming through the echo, "Down there." The lantern light began to spill over the edge of the arroyo, thin at first, then stronger, turning shadows into shapes that could be named. The man under Elias stilled for half a second, not surrender, but recognition. Time had run out. He twisted again, not toward the rifle this time, but away from it, rolling, trying to break contact entirely. Elias let him move just enough, then followed, not giving him space to stand, to run, to disappear back into the lines he had drawn so carefully. They came up together, breath hard, footing uncertain, and for a moment they faced each other again, closer now, the fight stripped down to something simpler, more immediate. "You should have left," the man said, voice tight, controlled slipping at the edges. Elias shook his head once. Too late for that. The lantern light grew stronger, spilling down into the arroyo in uneven waves as men found the edge and began to descend, boots loose on the slope, voices overlapping, calling to each other, building a different kind of momentum now, not fear, not yet, but the anticipation of finding something that would confirm what they already believed. The man glanced toward that light, then back at Elias, and in that look Elias saw the last calculation form. Not escape. Not anymore. Something else. The man moved suddenly, not toward Elias, but past him, one hand reaching into his coat, pulling free something small, dark, not a weapon in the way the town understood weapons, but dangerous all the same. Elias reacted without thinking, closing the distance again, his hand catching the man's wrist, forcing it down, away from whatever he had intended to do. They struggled there, locked, the object between them, pressure building as each tried to control the direction of it. "You don't get to finish this," Elias said, teeth set, voice low but hard now. The man's eyes met his, and for the first time there was something like anger there, not at Elias, but at the way the plan had unraveled. "It's already finished," he said. The lantern light broke fully into the arroyo then, blinding after the dark, voices rising as shapes resolved into men, into a struggle, into something that did not match the story they had brought with them. "Hold it," someone shouted. "Drop it," another voice called, louder, closer. Elias tightened his grip, forcing the man's hand open just enough to see what he held, a small pouch, leather, marked with the same ash he had seen before. Not magic. Not curse. Something made. Something placed. Evidence. The kind that did not fit the story. The man saw the recognition in Elias's eyes and made one last move, sudden and desperate, trying to tear free, to crush the pouch, to scatter whatever it contained before it could be seen clearly. Elias held on. The pressure built, then broke, not in escape, but in exposure, the pouch splitting just enough that its contents spilled into the dirt between them, fine and dark and unmistakably human in their purpose. The first lantern reached them then, light flooding the space, faces appearing above, around, eyes wide not with understanding, but with the shock of something unexpected interrupting a certainty they had already claimed. Elias did not look up right away. He kept his focus on the man in front of him, on the broken pouch, on the ash and fragments that now lay in the open where they could not be easily explained away. Behind him, boots hit the bottom of the arroyo, rifles lowered but still ready, voices asking questions that had no easy answers. And somewhere in that rising noise, the first crack in the town story began, small, fragile, but real enough that it could not be entirely unseen. The moment stretched longer than it should have, not because time slowed, but because no one knew what to do with what they were seeing, and in that hesitation Elias felt the entire weight of the town's belief falter just enough to become dangerous in a different way. The men at the bottom of the arroyo did not lower their rifles right away, even as their eyes dropped to the torn pouch, to the ash scattered across the dirt, to the man pinned under Elias who no longer fit the shape of the thing they had come hunting. "What is that?" someone asked, though the question carried no real curiosity, only resistance. Elias shifted his weight slightly, keeping the man's arm controlled, his voice steady when he answered. "Not what you thought," he said. "It was not enough. It would never be enough on its own." The preacher pushed forward then, forcing his way down the slope with less care than the others, boots slipping once before catching, his coat gathering dust as he reached the bottom. He stopped a few steps away, breathing harder than the moment required, his eyes moving not to the man on the ground, but to the scattered contents, as if trying to force them into a meaning that would not undo what he had already built. "This proves nothing," he said quickly. Too quickly. Elias met his gaze. "Then look closer," he replied. The preacher did not move. One of the cattlemen did, stepping in, crouching, his large hands hovering over the dirt before finally touching the ash, rubbing it between his fingers, lifting it to his nose. His expression shifted, confusion first, then something tighter. "This ain't," he started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence refusing to come. Elias took that moment, small as it was, and pushed it further. "You were told to look for something that would scare you," he said, not raising his voice, but letting it carry just enough. "You weren't told to look for this." The man under him let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had held any humor. "Doesn't matter," he said. "They won't change now." Elias tightened his grip slightly. "They already are," he said, though he knew how thin that was. The crowd above shifted, more men pressing down into the arroyo, lantern light multiplying, turning the space from shadow to something harsh and exposed. Faces appeared, one after another, each carrying the same question, the same need for this to fit into what they had decided hours ago. "Where is it?" someone called from above. "Where's the thing?" Elias looked up then, slowly, letting them see his face, letting them see that he was not afraid in the way they expected him to be. "You're looking at him," he said, nodding once toward the man beneath him. The reaction came in a wave, denial first, sharp and immediate. "No, that ain't," you said, voices overlapped, pushing against the idea, refusing it. The preacher stepped forward again, faster now, trying to regain control of something that was slipping. "This is a trick," he said. "A distraction." Elias shook his head once. "No," he said. This is what happens when someone knows exactly what you're afraid of. He reached down then, carefully, and picked up a piece of the torn pouch, holding it up so the lantern light caught the texture, the deliberate marks, the ash ground into it. This isn't old, he continued. It's made. Placed. Used. The cattleman who had touched the ash stood slowly, his eyes moving from the fragment to the man on the ground, then to the others around him. Why, he asked, not to Elias, but to the space itself, to the question that had finally broken through. The man under Elias answered before anyone else could. Because you were ready, he said. The words landed harder than anything else had. Not shouted. Not forced. Just true in a way that did not need volume. You wanted something to blame, he went on. I gave it to you. Silence followed that, not complete, but deeper than before, the kind that forms when people begin to see the edge of something they would rather not understand. Elias felt the shift then, subtle but real, the direction of the moment no longer entirely controlled by fear, but not yet guided by truth either. It was a narrow space. It would not hold long. The sheriff found this, Elias said, pressing the point before it could collapse. Or something close to it. That's why he didn't make it back. A murmur moved through the men, different from before, less certain, more fractured. The preacher opened his mouth to speak again, to reshape, to redirect, but the words did not come as easily now. The cattleman looked at him, not with agreement, but with expectation, and when no clear answer came, that expectation began to turn. Elias took a slow breath, feeling the moment balance on something that could still tip either way. He looked up toward the edge of the arroyo, toward the dark beyond the lantern light, and for a second he thought of Nita standing there, alone against all of this, and understood exactly how close the town had come to finishing something it could not take back. He looked down again at the man beneath him. It's over, he said quietly. The man's eyes held his, steady, unrepentant. No, he replied. It's just changing. And as the word settled into the space, Elias realized he was right, not about the outcome, but about the shape of what came next. Because breaking a lie did not end it. It only forced it to find a new place to stand. The silence did not hold as long as Elias needed it to, and that was the problem with men who had already chosen their fear. They did not abandon it, they reshaped it. The first voice to rise was not loud, but it carried the edge of something trying to survive. He ain't alone, someone said from the slope above, and just like that the space that had opened began to close again, not in the same direction, but toward something equally dangerous. Elias felt it immediately, the shift from certainty to suspicion, from one target to many, and he knew how quickly that could turn back toward the easiest one again. He tightened his grip on the man beneath him, not out of anger, but to keep at least one thing from slipping free. Then we ask him, Elias said, cutting across the rising noise, forcing the moment back to something solid. We don't guess. We don't fill in what we don't know. The preacher found his voice again at that, stepping forward with more force than before, as if volume could rebuild what had cracked. And you trust him to tell you the truth, he demanded. Elias looked up at him, steady. No, he said. But I trust what he can't hide. That answer did not settle the crowd, but it slowed them, and slowing was enough for now. Elias shifted slightly, easing just enough pressure off the man's arm to let him speak without giving him room to act. You said you needed time, Elias said. For what? The man's gaze flicked once to the faces around him, measuring, then back. Supply runs, he said. Routes no one watches because they're too busy looking for ghosts. A murmur moved through the men again, different this time, not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when something ugly fits too well with what has been happening quietly around them. You been stealing? The cattleman asked, voice low, dangerous now in a different way. The man on the ground gave a small shrug, as much as Elias's grip allowed. Moving, he said. Not stealing. Land changes hands. So do herds. People leave when they think something's out there waiting for them. He let that hang for a second, then added, you'd be surprised what fear will make a man sell cheap. Elias saw it then, clearer than before, not just a crime, but a pattern, something that had been building under the surface while the town told itself stories about shadows and curses. And the ash. Elias pressed. Markers, the man said. Signals. Places to meet. Places to avoid. He glanced toward the broken pouch on the ground. Different mixes. Different meanings. The cattleman swore under his breath, a rough, angry sound that had nothing to do with spirits and everything to do with being made a fool of. The preacher stepped in again, faster now, trying to regain ground that was slipping. This doesn't change what we've seen, he insisted. The tracks. The animals. The things you were shown, Elias cut in, not raising his voice, but placing each word carefully. Not the things that were there. The preacher's jaw tightened. And her, he demanded, jerking his head toward the edge of the arroyo, toward where Nita stood somewhere beyond the light. You saying she's got nothing to do with any of it? Elias held his gaze for a second, then shook his head once. I'm saying you decided that before you had a reason, he replied. That landed harder than the rest, not because it was louder, but because it pointed somewhere none of them wanted to look for. Long. The cattleman straightened, his attention no longer on the preacher, but on the man on the ground. Who else? He asked. Names. The man's expression shifted again, not fear, but calculation returning in a new form. Does it matter? He said. You've already got what you need to turn on each other. Elias felt that like a cold line down his spine, because it was true in a way that made the situation more fragile, not less. Breaking the first lie had not removed the danger. It had multiplied it. It matters, Elias said, his voice firmer now. Because if you don't say it, they'll fill it in themselves. The man studied him for a long second, then let out a slow breath. 2 riders out of dry mesa, he said finally. 1 runs supplies. 1 handles the land papers. You won't find them where you think. The cattleman nodded once, already turning that into action in his mind, something he could control, something he understood. That was good. It gave the town a direction that was not built on superstition. But it was not enough. Not yet. Elias looked up again, toward the edge of the arroyo, toward the dark beyond the lantern light. Bring her down, he said. The words cut through the noise in a different way, sharper, more immediate. A few men hesitated. Others shifted, uncertain now in a way they had not been before. The preacher opened his mouth again, but this time the cattleman spoke first. We hear from her, he said. Not a question. A decision. It moved through the group quickly, not unanimous, but strong enough to carry. Boots shifted. A couple of men turned, climbing back up the slope, lanterns swinging, light breaking and reforming as they moved. Elias watched them go, then looked back down at the man beneath him. You're not finished, he said quietly. The man gave a small, tired smile that did not reach his eyes. Neither are you, he replied. Above them, the night pressed in beyond the lantern glow, and somewhere at the edge of that light, where shadow met certainty and neither held cleanly, the next part of the truth waited to be spoken, not to fix what had been broken, but to decide what would be done with it. The men returned with her slower than they had gone. And that alone told Elias something had shifted above the arroyo, something quieter than fear but heavier than doubt. The lantern light broke along the slope in uneven steps as they descended, and when Nita Van stepped into the edge of it, the space seemed to tighten around her, not because she moved differently, but because everyone else did. She did not resist. She did not hurry. She walked as if the ground belonged to her in the same way it belonged to anyone else, and that steadiness unsettled more than any struggle would have. Elias rose to his feet as she reached the bottom, not stepping away from the man on the ground, but changing the shape of the moment just enough that it could hold one more truth without collapsing. They want to hear from you, he said, his voice even, not formal, not soft. Nita's eyes moved from him to the scattered ash, to the torn pouch, to the man beneath him, and in that brief sweep Elias saw recognition settle in, not surprise, but confirmation of something she had already understood. They already have, she said. Her voice carried differently than the others, not louder, but clearer, as if it did not need to push to be heard. The preacher stepped forward immediately, unwilling to let that stand. "Then say it plain," he demanded. "Say what this is." Nita looked at him, and for a second the entire arroyo seemed to wait on that exchange, the air holding still as if it understood the weight of what would come next. "This," she said, nodding once toward the ash, "is something made by men who want other men to stop looking." She did not raise her voice. She did not dress it in anything more than that. The simplicity of it cut deeper than anything Elias had said. The preacher's jaw tightened. "And the tracks," he pressed. "The animals?" "The fear leaves tracks too," she said, interrupting him without force, without anger. "You followed the ones that were loud." A murmur moved through the men, quieter now, less certain. The cattleman crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the ground where the ash lay. "And the other ones?" he asked. Nita's eye shifted to Elias for a fraction of a second, then back. "Those are harder," she said. "They don't ask to be seen." Elias felt that. Land in the space between them, completing something that had been building since the morning, a line drawn not between truth and lie, but between what was easy and what was real. He stepped slightly aside then, enough to give her the center of the moment without abandoning his hold on the man who had created it. "He said you were ready," Elias added, not to her, but to the others. "Ready to believe something like this." The man on the ground let out a low breath that might have been agreement. "Still are," he said. That drew eyes back to him, sharper now, less confused, more directed. The cattleman took a step forward, his voice no longer uncertain. "You're going to tell us everything," he said. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The man met his gaze, then glanced once toward Nita, as if measuring something there, something he had misjudged. "Already have," he said. "Enough." Nita shook her head slightly. "Not enough," she said. The word was quiet, but it shifted the air again. She stepped closer, not to Elias, not to the man, but to the space where the ash lay, and crouched, her hand hovering just above it, not touching, not disturbing. "You used this to mark your paths," she said, her tone unchanged. "To tell each other where to go, where not to go." The man did not answer. He did not need to. The truth of it was already visible. "And you chose me," she continued, rising slowly, "because you knew what story they would tell if you gave them a reason." Her eyes moved then, not to him, but to the men around them, to the faces that had turned toward her with certainty only hours before. "You knew they would not ask twice." That was the hardest part. Not the deception. The willingness to accept it. The preacher shifted, searching for something to reclaim, but the ground had changed under him, and his words no longer found the same easy hold. "We were protecting," he began. "You were deciding," Nita said, not unkindly, but without leaving room for the rest. The sentence ended there, because it had nowhere else to go. Elias watched the crowd, the way shoulders lowered, the way eyes dropped, not in full understanding, not yet, but in the beginning of something that might lead there if it was allowed to continue. He knew how fragile that was. He had seen it break before. The sheriff tried to follow the other tracks, Elias said, bringing it back, anchoring it. That's why he didn't make it. The cattleman nodded once, slow, the weight of that settling in a way the earlier fear had not. "Then we finish what he started," he said. It was the first clear direction that did not depend on a lie. It moved through the group differently, steadier, less urgent, but more real. Elias felt the shift, small but solid, and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked at Nita then. She met his gaze for a moment, and in that look there was no thanks, no relief, just acknowledgement of what had been done and what it had cost to get there. Around them, the lantern light steadied, no longer searching for something imagined, but illuminating what was already present. The night did not change. The land did not soften. But the story that had been building since morning cracked open fully, and for the first time, what stood in its place was not certain, but it was at least facing in the right direction. The town did not erupt the way Elias might have expected, and that was what made the moment heavier, not lighter, because anger at least moved forward, but this turned inward, folding back on itself in ways that were harder to see and harder to stop. The men in the arroyo shifted, some stepping back, some stepping closer, but none of them speaking right away, as if the words they had used all day no longer fit the shape of what stood in front of them. The cattleman broke the silence first, not loud, not for effect, but because something in him had settled into a direction he understood. "We go after the others," he said. "Tonight." A few heads nodded. "Not all." "Enough." It was movement without panic, and that alone marked the difference. Elias watched it form, this new line of action, and felt the tension in his chest ease just enough to remind him how tight it had been. He did not let it go completely. Not yet. Not here. The preacher stood still, his hands tight at his sides, his voice gone quiet, not from acceptance, but from the loss of a clear path. He looked at Nita once, then away, as if the act of seeing her now required something he had not prepared himself to give. No apology came. Elias had not expected one. Some things did not arrive on the same day as the truth. The man on the ground did not resist as the cattlemen pulled him up, binding his hands with a length of rope that had likely been meant for something else entirely. He stood without struggle, his eyes moving once across the group, not searching for sympathy, but marking faces, storing them the way a man does when he knows the shape of consequences has changed but not disappeared. "You're too late for some of it," he said, almost casually, as if offering a final piece not out of kindness, but because it no longer cost him anything. "Roots don't close just because you see them." The cattleman gave a short, sharp nod. "We'll see about that." It was not bravado. It was work. Elias stepped back then, letting the others take control of what came next, because this part did not belong to him anymore, not in the same way. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Nita at the edge of the light again, where she had returned without anyone asking her to move. She stood as she had before, still, contained, present without claiming the center. For a moment, the noise of the men faded behind him, and the two of them existed in a quieter space that had nothing to do with the outcome and everything to do with what had almost happened instead. "They won't forget this," Elias said. Nita's eyes shifted to him, then past him, toward the town that waited beyond the arroyo. "No," she said. "But they won't remember it the way it was either." That was the part he understood too well. Stories did not stay still. They bent, softened, hardened, depending on who carried them and why. "And you?" he asked. "What happens for you now?" She was quiet for a second, not because she did not know, but because the answer did not need to be rushed. "I leave before morning," she said. Elias nodded once, the motion small, the acceptance in it larger than it looked. "They'll say that means something," he said. "They'll say a lot of things," she replied. "That's not new." He almost smiled at that, but it did not quite reach his face. "You could stay," he said, though even as he said it, he knew what the answer would be. Nita shook her head slightly. "Staying doesn't change what they already chose to see," she said. "Leaving doesn't either. But it keeps me from becoming part of whatever story they tell next." That was reason enough. Elias reached up then, his fingers brushing the pendant where it rested against his chest. He pulled it free, holding it in his hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it now not as a question, but as something that had already passed through too many hands, too many meanings. He stepped closer and held it out to her. "This belongs with you," he said again. This time, she took it. Her fingers closed around the silver, her thumb finding the worn place along its edge as naturally as if it had never left her. For a second, the world narrowed to that small exchange, the object passing back to where it made sense, the line of it completed in a way the rest of the night had not been. "You kept it safe," she said. Elias shook his head once. "I kept it moving," he replied. She considered that, then gave a slight nod, as if that distinction mattered more than it sounded. Behind them, the men began to move out of the arroyo, the prisoner led between them, lanterns lifting, light climbing the walls as they went, carrying with them a new purpose that would take them into the night again, but not in the same direction, not for the same reasons. The sound of their boots faded slowly, leaving the space quieter, emptier, the air settling back into something closer to what it had been before any of this began. Elias stood there a moment longer, the absence of the pendant at his chest noticeable in a way he had not expected. "You were right," he said finally. "About the tracks." Nita looked out toward the open land, where the dark stretched wide and unbroken. "Most people don't look for the quiet ones," she said. "They take too long." Elias followed her gaze, the horizon a thin line between shadow and something not yet light. "Seems like that's where most things worth finding are," he said. She did not answer that. She did not need to. The truth of it sat there on its own, steady, without needing to be carried any further. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in along the edges of the land, turning the black of night into a thin blue that carried more weight than light, and by the time the first true line of sun broke over the horizon, Rattlesnake Crossing already looked like a place that had decided to keep what it could and leave the rest where it fell. Elias stood in the street where the pendant had first been lying, boots set in the same dust that now held a different set of tracks, some leading out, some circling back, all of them quieter than the ones from the day before. The town was awake, but not fully, doors opening slower, voices lower, as if people were testing how much of yesterday had followed them into today. He watched a pair of men cross toward the stable, speaking in short sentences that did not carry, their eyes not quite meeting. Work had returned, or at least the shape of it had, but it moved with a hesitation that had not been there before. That would fade, he knew. It always did. What would remain was harder to see, buried under whatever version of the story they chose to keep. He reached up out of habit, fingers brushing the place at his chest where the pendant had been, and found only fabric. The absence sat there, not heavy, not light, just present, like something that had passed through him and left a space shaped like itself behind. Down the street, the preacher stood outside the chapel, hands folded, posture straight, speaking to a small group that listened without the same certainty they had held the day before. The words did not carry, but the tone did, careful now, measured, as if each sentence had to step around something that might still be there if he moved too quickly. The cattleman rode out with 3 others not long after sunrise, heading toward Dry Mesa, toward the names that had been given, toward work that could be done with hands instead of fear. That, at least, would leave a mark that did not shift with the telling. Elias watched them go. Then turned his gaze west, toward the line of low hills where the land rose and folded into itself, where the tracks grew harder to read and the stories less certain. Nita was already there, a small figure against the distance, her horse moving at a steady pace that did not ask to be followed. She did not look back. She did not need to. The space between them held what it needed to without that. Elias stepped forward once, then stopped, the motion unfinished, not because he could not go after her, but because there was nothing to add to what had already been said. Some things did not improve with one more word, one more step. The sun climbed higher, the light sharpening, pulling detail back into the world, wood grain, dust lines, the faint marks left by boots and hooves that would be gone by the next wind. Elias stood there a moment longer, letting it settle, the town behind him, the open land ahead, the line between them clearer now than it had been when he arrived. He adjusted the brim of his hat, a small, familiar motion, and turned back toward the street, toward whatever came next, knowing it would not be clean, not entirely, but knowing also that it would at least begin from something closer to the truth than the day before. Behind him, the hills took Nita in slowly, the distance closing around her until she became part of the land itself, not hidden, not lost, just no longer something the town could point to and name. The wind moved through the street once, lifting dust in a low, brief spiral where the pendant had first been found, then letting it fall again, the ground returning to its quiet, holding what had happened without offering it up, leaving it to those who had been there to decide what it meant, and what it would cost them to remember it clearly.